Let us begin, dear listener, by placing you gently in a place you most certainly do not want to be. The air is thick, not misty, romantic English countryside thick. No, this air is thick in the way soup is. A chunky, chewy stew of bodily fluids, rotting flesh, fermented animal brains, and dreams that lost their way. Congratulations, you've just stepped into a 14th century medieval tannery. You're barefoot, because of course you are. Shoes are a luxury reserved not for peasants or apprentices, but for those who haven't just spilled a vat of urine all over their legs. Yes, you heard me right. Urine. Human. Let that sink in. In fact, let everything sink in. It's what the hides are doing as we speak. Now, in case you were holding hope that this tannery was perhaps one of the more polished medieval crafts, allow me to tenderly disabuse you of that notion. You see, while blacksmithing will burn your eyebrows off and glass blowing threatens your lungs, tanning, leather making, goes straight for the nose and never lets go. Tanneries were commonly set up outside the main village, not because of zoning laws, but because no one could stand the smell. Not even medieval people who, let's be honest, had a fairly relaxed relationship with hygiene. The process began with securing raw animal hides. These would be sheep, goats, deer, cows if you were lucky, rats and mystery animals if you were resourceful. These hides had to be prepared, which is a quaint euphemism for scraping off the flesh and hair with a curved blade called a lunarium, which sounds lunar but feels very intestinal. And where better to do this than on a wooden beam soaked in rain and regret? The pungent perfume of the place came not just from rotting flesh, though it did pull its weight, but from the divine concoction used to tenderize those stubborn hides. Dog dung and aged urine. Some mixtures were lovingly fermented for weeks in stone vats. Urine collected in communal pots located conveniently near taverns and brothels. After all, nothing says neighborhood bonding like pee for your country's leather. The tanner's apprentice, perhaps this is you now, would be tasked with stomping the hides in this sloshy mixture in a pair of knee-high boots, or no boots at all, depending on your station, and whether or not you'd learned to feel shame yet. The process took hours. The smell took centuries to forget. At every stage, you'd need to avoid accidentally poisoning yourself with ammonia or giving yourself a nasty infection via open sore. And since gloves hadn't been invented yet, or rather, were reserved for people who needed their hands for things other than dung stomping, your poor skin would be perpetually pickled and calloused. We must also consider the aesthetic qualities of a tannery. Imagine rows of animal hides stretched on racks like medieval laundry day, each one dripping suspiciously into the earth. Crows and other opportunistic diners circled and strutted, acting far too comfortable around humans. Occasionally, a passing noble might wave a perfume kerchief over his nose, while a nearby monk mumbled prayers for your olfactory soul. And yet, leather was crucial. This stinking art provided material for shoes, belts, book bindings, water flasks, armor, and ecclesiastical elegance. Leather, in its pre-freshman sociology phase, was literally holding the Middle Ages together. Even kings needed tanners, though they'd sooner invite a jester to dinner than a man who reeked like fermented dog poo and goat scalp. The tanner's lot was modest, financially unglamorous, and olfactorily cursed. Still, there was honor in the craft. Kind of, if you squinted, with your eyes closed, from very far away. So, the next time you tug on a leather boot or lovingly crack open an old book with a hidebound spine, just whisper a quiet thank you to the medieval tanner, the underappreciated artisan whose greatest legacy was never being invited to parties. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. For now though, take a deep, fresh breath. Unperfumed by 14th century footwear, your journey has only just begun. The first thing you'd notice inside a medieval tannery, after your nostrils attempted to resign in protest, would be how oddly busy it was. Not bustling in the usual charming market town sense, with cheerful bakers hollering over baguettes or kindly butchers weighing sausages. No, this was a more specific kind of chaos. It was the chaos of skins, goat, cow, sheep, occasionally even deer, stretching, flapping, soaking, and being scraped with the sort of attention one usually reserves for stubborn wallpaper. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a little step back. Soften the edges. Imagine a small medieval town, stone cottages slouching under thatch hats, church bells chiming the quarter hour, and cobbled lanes meandering like sleepy thoughts. Somewhere, usually as far downwind as urban practicality allowed, the tannery squats near a creek or river, because work like this requires water. And when I say requires water, I mean gallons of it, usually infused with a veritable soup of unspeakable things on their way to becoming leather. In the early hours of an overcast Tuesday, because every good medieval horror apparently starts on a Tuesday, your new job begins. You've just been hired as a tanner's apprentice, which might sound quaint, until the reality of the job begins to seep in, much like the liquid inside the soaking pits. The foreman greets you with a grunt and a bucket. Not a bucket of coffee. No. A bucket of, well, let's just say the word organic takes on whole new dimensions in this context. First order of business, hair removal. Not yours, the hides. And while today we have razors, wax strips, and laser clinics, our medieval friends relied on ash-based lye or fermented urine to loosen the stubborn fuzz from the animal skins. Yes, urine. Human. Collected in jugs from local patrons who were paid a small fee for their contribution to the olfactory offensive of the neighborhood. P for a penny, as they didn't quite say. These hides were then soaked in large vats of this potent solution. Your job, dear listener, might involve stirring them with your hands, bare hands, because gloves were for night and winter, not for apprentices. Imagine gently wading your fingers through a lukewarm stew of yesterday's goat and last week's lunch. Cozy, isn't it? And if you're thinking to yourself, well, at least this stage is short, bless your modern optimism. This could last several days. Skins lounging in their urine baths like tipsy debutantes in unpleasantly scented jacuzzis. Only when the hair slipped right off and the skin felt supple enough was it time to move to the next fun chapter, fleshing. That's where you scrape off bits of fat and connective tissue with a curved knife, usually mounted on a beam. If the image of smearing cold fat off a cow's backside while ankle deep in yesterday's bath hasn't lulled you into dreams just yet, just wait. But there was artistry here, believe it or not. Controlled decay, a flirtation with rot. You had to massage the leather just enough to soften it, but not so much that it disintegrated and joined the compost heap out back. And these tanners knew just how long to leave the hides in each phase, how to judge by the smell, the color, or possibly the alignment of the stars, or at least the crows roosting above the workshop. Smell, by the way, was a major occupational hazard. The aroma of the tannery was legendary. Towns passed laws keeping these workshops away from populated areas, not just for the stench, though honestly, that was reason enough, but because the work attracted flies. Lots of flies. some enthusiastic to the point of despair. You see, medieval tanners were part scientist, part brute, part magician, and all nose-blind. It was not a trade for the chewily sentimental or the faint of olfactory constitution. Yet it was vital. Leather was everywhere, from shoes to belts to book bindings to armor straps. Civilization, it turned out, was held together by rotting skins and human pee. And here you are, at the bottom rung, with a bucket and a smile fading faster than the tannin leaves used to stain and preserve the hides. The scent clings to your clothes, your skin, your dreams. But give it time. The rot becomes routine. The stench becomes home. And somewhere, between the scraping and the soaking, you learn the quiet art of giving dead things new purpose. Tomorrow, though, tomorrow is Lime Day. And that, dear listener, comes with a whole new bucket of joy. Picture it now, the soft, amber light of early morning filtering lazily through the soot-scratched windows of a medieval tannery. Birds chirp gently outside, before promptly flying far, far away from the nose-wrinkling horror wafting up from the yard. And there, among the heaving vats and hunched workers, you, somehow wearing very clean sneakers, begin to appreciate just how profoundly unprepared you are for what's ahead. Tanning leather was not an industry for the faint of heart or nose. It was the medieval equivalent of working at a garbage incinerator during a sewage strike on a warm summer day. And yet, this was the indispensable backdrop to everything from saddles to shoes, gloves, to grim-looking book covers. Without tanners, medieval society would have been walking barefoot and extremely damp. You see, long before factory belts and Employee of the Month awards, the medieval tanner began work at dawn, sometimes earlier, depending on how eager the village roosters were to remind everyone of their respiratory decisions. The first order of business, dealing with skins, piles and piles of animal hides, often sheep, goats, cows, still remarkably invested in retaining their fur. These skins weren't pristine specimens either. Imagine something your dog might roll in and then apologize for later. Now multiply that aroma by 20, add the heat of the day, and sprinkle in a hearty drizzle of medieval hygiene. Or rather, the absence thereof. Of course, you couldn't just toss a hide into a bucket and wait for it to turn into Gucci. First, you had to remove the hair, an exercise in both persistence and powerful olfaction. This was accomplished using a technique known as liming. Essentially, the tanner would soak the hides in vats of lime water, often mixed with just the right amount of mystery goo, usually urine, which, by the way, tanners often collected from neighbours in what could very loosely be described as a community effort. Urine, yes, human urine, and not in tiny pipettes or tidy laboratory flasks, in jugs, barrels, sometimes generously gifted in the full bladder straight from the source. It was considered such a necessary commodity that there were even tax breaks and commercial traders dealing in it. In some cities, people were paid to donate, effectively making medieval bladders a thriving side hustle. The ammonia in the urine helped break down fats and loosen hair, making the defurring process slightly less Sisyphean. Slightly. After soaking, the poor hide was stretched over a wooden beam and scraped with a curved two-handled knife, a medieval invention that doubled as both a hair removal tool and a good excuse for carpal tunnel syndrome 400 years before anyone had a desk job. As you, our time-traveling innocent, try not to gag. A foul mound of hair, fat and tissue begins to pile beside you, joining its dear friends on the pungent hill of Tanner's byproducts. There is no escaping it. Every breath is a commitment. Now, here's a charming twist. Once de-haired, The hide still had more goopy adventures ahead. The next stage, baiting. Baiting was the gentle art of softening the hide using enzymes. Where did those enzymes come from? Birds. Specifically, their droppings. Pigeon poop, to be precise. Soft, squishy, cheerfully deposited in clay pots scattered around town. The hides were massaged with these gifts from our feathered friends, then stomped, pounded, massaged again, and left to ripen like some unspeakable cheese. And while all this was happening, no one was wearing gloves, or masks, or boots. The medieval tanner simply accepted their fate, trudging home at the end of the day so permeated with odor that flowers wilted in protest as they passed. But despite the smell, the infection risks, and the startling frequency with which teeth fell out or lungs failed, tanning was a necessary and respected, even if somewhat socially distant, trade. The leather produced here would go on to cradle the feet of kings, reinforce armor, bind manuscripts full of sacred words, and yet the people who toiled behind the scenes lived short lives, largely uncelebrated, and often, well, alone at parties. And so, with the sun lifting gently above the rooftops, and you, still clutching a perfumed handkerchief like a lifeline, join the ranks of all who underestimated the medieval tanner's world. It was dirty, vital work, the kind no one thanks you for, unless they need a new belt. But let's leave the pigeons and putrid vats behind for now, and tiptoe towards something just as essential, yet far less aromatic. The sun rises reluctantly over the medieval horizon, filtering through a gauze of mist and wood smoke, as if even the light is hesitant to enter this particular corner of town. The Tannery district, known affectionately to its neighbors as downwind, stirs to life. Although life might be a strong word, it's more of a perseverance, a willingness to inhale and continue despite all better instincts. In the world of medieval trades, tanners were, well, let's say underappreciated. They dealt in skins, cowhide, goat, sheep, the occasional deer if someone in the village had shown any hunting promise, and turned them into usable leather, that soft pouch you dreamily imagine a nobleman pulling coins from. That was once soaked in months of unspeakable liquids, and there's a modest chance that more than one of those liquids began in a chamber pot. Before we even get to the tanner though, let's talk procurement. Skin acquisition begins not with a flourish, but with butchery. Animals were slaughtered where it was most convenient. The town square, the kitchen yard, occasionally in the middle of a moral debate about gluttony. After meat was removed and furs admired or dismissed, the hides made their way to the tanners, often flung onto carts alongside turnips, gossip, and the occasional surly apprentice. Now, if you were the unfortunate sole apprentice to a tanner, congratulations, and also condolences. Your welcome package included a wooden stool, a blunt scraping knife, and about 3 minutes before you questioned every decision that led to this point. Your first job would be de-hairing the hides, not with lasers, not with lotions, but with lime. No, not the citrus. That would have been too luxurious for this tale. This lime was calcium hydroxide, a caustic, alkaline compound stored in unassuming yet ominous vats. Hides would be soaked in vats of this solution for days or weeks, loosening the hair and the top layer of skin until they resembled a leathery lasagna noodle left too long at the dance. The smell. Imagine a festival of wet wool socks, sour cheese, and a faint top note of despair. Then multiply that by a village. That's your oxygen now. Once sufficiently marinated, hides were heaved onto wooden beams, and you, dear apprentice, would set upon them with a curved knife, scraping away the goopy remnants of fat, flesh, and fur. This was done while bent at the waist for hours, a posture that encouraged both sciatica and philosophizing. Many a leather worker became a theologian by week 2. And what joy once the scraping was done. Why then it was time to truly tan the hide. The method, a gentle bath in fermented animal matter. We are, of course, referring to dog dung. Yes, actual dog feces was a treasured staple of the medieval tannery, rich in enzymes, beloved by no one, and collected from city streets by the bucketful. Children were even hired to gather it, which I imagine they mention frequently in later therapy scrolls. The hides would soak in this warm brown concoction and be massaged repeatedly to render them supple. "They're calming down," old tanners would mutter as they kneaded the poop-steeped leather with calloused hands. Don't think about that massage too much. Of course, not all tanning was entirely fecal. Some hides were processed with tannins from oak bark or gall nuts, steeped in wooden barrels for months. It was a slower, gentler method, but still, let's not romanticize it. At no point did the workshop smell of forest and freedom. More likely, it resembled a swampy stew infused with notes of agony and ambition. Once the leather was finally dried and finished, it didn't miraculously start smelling like sandalwood. Even properly tanned leather had an aroma best described as historically evocative. But it was sturdy, useful, and profitable, though ironically, none of that wealth trickled down to the man who had manually massaged a hide after 3 weeks in dog excrement. There were towns, particularly in England, where you could recognize a tanner's home by its strategic location, far away. Tanners were often set outside the city gates, in neighborhoods sharing real estate with butchers, executioners, and other professionals one might consider socially aromatic. And yet, the medieval world needed them. Every book cover, every saddle, every boot and belt, all had passed through hands steeped in a scent so persistent, it could haunt a poem. So as you drift deeper into your pillow, try to imagine the steady rhythm of wet leather being stretched on drying racks, the soft thud of scrapings, the occasional slosh from a shifting vat. It might be gruesome, yes, but there's a certain lullaby quality in its predictability. Somewhere beyond the heap of hides and a bucket half full of, well, let's not label it. Another tanner reaches for his morning ale, ignoring the way his boots squish slightly. Soon he will sit down on a stool older than feudalism and begin another slow, inelegant transformation of skin into story. And if you think this was rough, you haven't been introduced to the medieval town privy quite yet. If you happen to be downwind of a medieval tannery around the year 1350, chances are you'd suddenly discover a pressing appointment in the opposite direction. The kind of appointment that requires urgent movement through heavy doors, perhaps followed by breathing deeply into a scented linen handkerchief and quietly questioning your life choices. For within these peculiar-smelling buildings, artisans performed a gruesome, goopy dance of transformation, turning raw animal skins into something vaguely wearable, and doing so with ingredients better suited to a cauldron scene in a particularly revolting fairy tale. But let's shuffle closer, ever so gently, and peek inside. The tannery itself was rarely demurely tucked away. It couldn't be. Not when the work produced a bouquet so pungent it made the Thames look like a scented bath. You see, tanning relied on delightful substances like fermented urine, rotting flesh, dog droppings, and the buttery innards of cows. Combine those in the wrong order, and you don't get leather. You get banned from family dinners. So you arrive. You've bravely volunteered, or stumbled sleepily, into the cobbled yard of Master Theobald's tannery. A modest operation, nestled behind the local butcher, and directly downhill from the bakery, whose pastries you now think you'll skip. Theobald, an alarmingly cheerful man with the scent profile of an unwashed hound's laundry basket, greets you with a smile so warm it nearly cancels out the olfactory assault of his apron. "Right then," he chirps, "time to soak the hides." Soaking, in this context, refers to plunging raw skins into vats of urine collected from local families. Yes, neighbours were kindly asked to donate to the cause. It was considered a civic duty to pee in a dedicated pot and leave it outside your home each evening. The phrase "taking the piss" might have originated in jest, but in the tanning world, it was quite literal. The ammonia helped break down the stubborn fats and bits of meat on the skin. Pleasant thought, isn't it? You, our freshly time-travelled onlooker, kneel to stir the foul brew with a long willow stick, noting quietly that your ancestors were either marvellously inventive or perhaps deeply unforgiving. You suppress a grimace as your cloak absorbs some of the aroma now gallantly attempting to fuse with your very soul. After its urine bath, the skin is scraped. Usually placed over a convex wooden bench, the tanner uses a curved knife, something between a blade and a bad idea, to shave off those lingering scraps of flesh. This is delicately referred to as fleshing. It is neither a poetic nor an elegant affair. There is slipping, there is flinging, there is swearing that rings off the timber beams in 3 languages, and one that might be a kind of duck. Next comes the liming stage, where hides are dunked in an alkaline paste to further loosen hair. At this point in the process, the hides smell less like animal and more like an emotional outburst from a bog. One reaches a state of enlightenment here, mostly because the fumes encourage regular hallucinations. You're not sure, but you think you've started to understand the ducks. Once de-haired, it's time for the real magic, the tanning itself. And here, dear dreamer, is where we meet the most unintentionally poetic ingredient of the trade: dog dung, specifically referred to, with a straight face, as puppy manure. It was gathered from the streets, or more efficiently, sold by professional collectors. Yes, that was a job title. And mixed into paste. The enzymes in the dung help to make the leather soft and pliable. If you're wondering whether the tanner's hands were supple year-round, the answer is yes, but at a cost too great for most to bear. With the paste applied, the hides were pounded, folded, squashed, and massaged. And you, perhaps at this point, are gently considering a new plan for medieval employment. One perhaps with a little less aroma and a tad more dignity, like plague rat wrangler or bishop's jester. The final step in our olfactory odyssey is drying. The hides are hung, stiff, reeking flags of perseverance, until fully cured. Once dried and softened, the pelts may be dyed using crushed insects, iron filings, or, in an especially festive village, elderberries. The tanner, with cracked hands and stained shoes, would survey the finished stack with pride, and then, likely, shoo away the cats. You begin to back away from this aromatic wonderland, shoes squishing, eyes misting, nostrils whispering quiet screams. And yet, oddly enough, something tugs at your curiosity. Perhaps it's the thought that, amid all the stench and indignity, medieval tanners were key figures of commerce. Smelly, yes, but indispensable. As the echoes of scraping knives and sloshing hides fade into the distance, let's gently wander onward. There's another part of this medieval village that holds secrets of its own, and fewer buckets of dog dung. Probably, if you were quietly wandering through the muddy alleyways of a 14th century European town, with a sensitive modern nose and equally sensitive modern dignity, your olfactory system would have filed for resignation about 3 doorways ago. The scent that met you now, however, would better be described as a performance. Musky, swampy, hints of old meat, perhaps a top note of medieval regret. Welcome to the Tanner's Quarter. Now, unlike the relative glamour of a blacksmith's forge or the charming mystery of an apothecary's den, a tannery was, how shall we put it, less Versailles, more armpit of civilization. But leather had to come from somewhere, and it sure wasn't IKEA. Take a gentle breath, or perhaps don't. The art, if we dare call it that, of tanning animal hides required a no-nonsense mix of science, patience, and bodily fluids that most folks would prefer remain unnamed in polite society. The process could take up to a year, depending on the method, and it began with a dead animal and a dream. The dream being that one day, this bloated cowskin could become a nice belt, or maybe a pouch to keep squirrel jerky in. Step 1. Dehairing. Hide in hand, the medieval tanner would submerge it into a solution affectionately referred to as the lime pit. Sounds rather pleasant compared to what it was. A bubbling, chalky bath made with a powerful alkali, typically lime, and sometimes mixed with ash. This helped loosen up the hair follicles so they could scrape the hide clean. If you're picturing a medieval man in grimy leather boots furiously shaving a floppy skin on a wooden beam while flies waltz in and out of view, you're exactly right. Turn the volume down, and this could almost be peaceful. Once the hair was gone, the hide had to be delimed, returning it to a gentler pH, and soaked in something rich in enzymes to break down the leftover tissue. And this, dearest dreamer, is where our quiet little bedtime tale dips into the great historical pool of fermented substances, specifically dog poop. Yes, dog feces, or pure, as the tanners called it, with a straight face and, presumably, a half-hearted gag. It was collected, sometimes purchased, from the streets. Children might be paid a coin or two to wrangle the neighbourhood's deposits into buckets. A quaint pocket money task, though one that likely left young Timmy rather unpopular in the playground. These droppings were mixed with water and used to make a bait, a slurry into which the unassuming hide was dunked and kneaded. Why, you ask, would anyone do such a pungent thing? Because the bacteria in the mess broke down the proteins and fats in the skin, rendering it softer and more pliable, useful, marketable, less like a cow on vacation and more like boots. Imagine standing knee-deep in a wooden vat of this mixture, pushing hides around rhythmically, with the sun beaming down and no such thing as antibacterial hand soap. A soft squelch beneath your feet, and the soft caw of a carrion crow overhead. Tranquility, truly. Once the hide had spent quality time in its fecal spa, it would be rinsed and then tanned proper, most often with tannins from oak bark. That's where we get the word tanning, not from some unfortunate sunbather. The hides would be pit tanned, left for months to slowly soak up the bark's astringent goodness, while the tanner went about other business, perhaps sobbing gently or refilling the poop bucket. And when it was finally done, you would have leather, stiff at first, but ready to be softened, greased, cut, sewn, ready to travel as a satchel or protect feet from cobblestone splinters, ready to make money. For the tanner, this was both victory and vindication. All the sweat, smell, shame, and saturated filth had not been in vain, unless of course the hide rotted at any point, in which case, back to square one. The irony, of course, was that while the townsfolk desperately needed the tanner's work, for belts, gloves, sword sheaths, harnesses, and about 200 more essential medieval items, They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the man himself, a social pariah with useful hands and a regrettable aroma. A leather alchemist who turned sludge into utility, one hide at a time, while people crossed the street to avoid eye contact. But not you. If you've listened this far, dreamer, you're clearly made of stranger fibre. You've stayed through the scentscape and the slurry, and you've even begun to admire the process for its dedication. You may never look at a leather bookmark the same way again. Now, let's quietly leave the tannery behind, a little wiser, and definitely more grateful for modern sanitation. Ahead lies another corner of the medieval world, one that's just as strange, and perhaps even softer underfoot. If you had just arrived at a medieval tannery, perhaps summoned by a curiosity for tradesmen in woolen hose and an appreciation for well-crafted leather boots, you'd likely find yourself desperately regretting that decision within mere seconds. You see, despite the quaint illustrations in storybooks, a rosy-cheeked tanner working by lantern light in a cozy stone shed, the actual job was rather less romantic. Think less artisan work in a hobbit village, and more prehistoric chemistry experiment gone wrong, with a hint of bucket. By this point in your odoriferous journey, you would have already endured the lime pits, where animal hides were steeped in caustic concoctions until their hair surrendered in furry defeat. And though that process was gruesome, it was only setting the stage for what came next, a task known politely as baiting. But don't let the gentle name fool you. Baiting was the step where tanners, after cleaning the hides, made them soft and supple. The way you might now drop your expensive sneakers into a fancy gym bag with cedar balls, medieval tanners dropped their hides into a mixture partially made of fermented dog poo. I'll pause here for your face to do whatever it needs to do. Yes, canine excrement. Preferred fresh, but wealthier tanners might go for the aged stuff, like a fine cheese turned wrong. Your average tanners employed neighborhood children, or, on unlucky days, their own youngsters, to gather the fragrant bounty from the streets. Canine digestive leftovers were plentiful in towns with cobbled lanes and no leash laws, presenting both a public nuisance and a surprising opportunity for leather innovation. Why dog waste specifically, you ask? Because digestion, as it turns out, is sort of nature's chemistry set. The enzymes in the feces would break down proteins in the animal hide, relaxing the leathery stiffness and making it more workable. Tanners would often stir the hides in this poop stew, occasionally by hand or by foot, or, once tired of slipping, with long wooden paddles that bore suspiciously dark stains and an aroma so committed to the senses it could survive several lifetimes. If you're wondering how anyone could endure standing knee-deep in this seeping reality, remember, they didn't know any differently. Life was full of smells then. The average medieval person was encircled by a cloud of odours with the social norms of a drunken goose. If you passed out from the baiting process, it probably wasn't from the scent alone. It was more likely dehydration, heat stroke, or an unwise breakfast. And there were still more steps to go. Following the generous fecal bath, hides needed to be thoroughly rinsed in clean water. Well, cleanerish. Rivers did the job quite well, which explains why many tanneries were built on the outskirts of town, conveniently downstream from drinking spots. That way, the townspeople upstream could enjoy their water relatively unflavoured, while the tanners toiled among the downstream stew of suds, hide slop, and the occasional curious duck who would live to regret its decision. But not all labour was equal. Within the guilds and workshops, seasoned tanners developed precise skills, judging leather by sight, flex, and that mysterious sixth sense of whether the hide would hold a curve or crumple like a week-old turnip. Apprentices learned the trade by doing, mostly because their noses gave out after day 3 and their hands forgot what softness ever felt like. Gloves didn't exist for this work. The very texture you loved in your satchel or pair of boots came at the cost of raw knuckles and fingers permanently dyed by mysterious substances no one catalogued. Still, despite the stench, or perhaps because of it, the trade persisted. Tanners were necessary, if not particularly beloved. They lived separately, often on the outermost edges of towns, near trees but far from parishes. Their houses smelled like their jobs, which is perhaps why they weren't known for throwing dinner parties. And yet, if you owned a pair of gloves, or a belt that lasted 3 winters, or a saddle that didn't tear under your flour-hauling donkey, all that was thanks to the gory perseverance of a craftsman who spent his life dancing with foul-smelling science. And if you think that was the low point of the tanning process, well, wait until you hear what came after all the feces were finally washed off. Now picture this. Your eyes barely open beneath the low beams of a soot-darkened shed, and you've been rudely awoken by the charming aroma of boiled urine. Yes, again, another glorious day in the medieval tannery, where the only reward for surviving yesterday is the opportunity to smell exactly like yesterday. You shuffle from the straw mat, if you're lucky, and begin your morning by rinsing your hands in a bucket of suspicious water that may or may not have been changed this week. But let's not quibble over such modern notions as hygiene. In the golden age of tanning, that is, somewhere between the late Middle Ages and your nostrils giving out entirely, people didn't so much wash their hands as begrudgingly wave them around near water and then call it a day. Outside, the first rays of sunlight hit the dripping pelts that hang like laundry after a particularly gothic laundry day. They're stiff as boards, smelling faintly of goat, strongly of decay, and wrapped in the vague promise of commerce. Today's task, flesh removal, or if we're feeling continental, defleshing. It's a job of great nobility and considerable splatter zone. Gripping a curved knife, beautifully handcrafted, if we're being fair. You bend over a wooden beam called a beam knife horse, which sounds rather gallant, but is essentially a slightly curved log propped on sticks. Here, you yank the hide over the beam and begin scraping away the gooey vestiges of once was an animal. Sweet dreams. It's repetitive work, and not without peril. One slip, and your thumbs may become tomorrow's workshop mystery. And since gloves are a luxury afforded only to popes and blacksmiths, your hands get to know the inside of a carcass better than they probably ever wanted. But let's pause for gratitude. At least it's not lime day. Ah yes, lime, as in calcium hydroxide. Not zesty, not refreshing. This was the stuff used to loosen the hair on the hides before they could be tanned. And when I say loosen, I mean in the sense of utterly dissolve the follicles, with a paste so caustic it could eat holes in your boots and your schedule. Hides sat in lime pits for days or even weeks, growing progressively slimier and angrier. Your job was to hoist them out with a long rake while trying not to fall in. Falling in, to be clear, wouldn't kill you right away. But immersion in a pit of lime slurry was a fast track to spontaneous regret and a slow track to massive skin lesions. Medieval insurance didn't cover chemical burns. Medieval insurance was generally just not dying. Despite the occupational hazards and general pong, the tanner occupied a strange space in medieval society. Indispensable, yet repellent. People needed you for precisely the things they hoped never to think about, like marriage counselors or tax collectors. You provided leather, crucial for shoes, belts, armor, book covers, and even wine bags, yet your shop conveniently lived downstream, downwind, and ideally, down a ravine. Back in the tannery, you pause for lunch, which today is a thick hunk of bread that could easily double as a weapon, plus whatever cheese hasn't walked off by itself. You eat with the team, Gil the scraper, Wylam the barkman, and that apprentice who's taken to whistling tunes that start in major and somehow turn minor around the third note. The table talk, though coarsely entertaining, is best left undescribed if we want anyone to sleep tonight. Afterward, it's time for the real dance, a kind of medieval alchemy involving tannins. You soak the hides in large vats filled with crushed oak bark and water. Why oak? Because oak is full of tannic acid, which binds with the proteins in the skin to, well, stop them being skin. It's what transforms hides from something that drapes over an ox into something that can shame a footpath in style for years. But here's the rub, literally. The hides need stirring, swishing, and shifting from vat to vat. If they sit still, the process goes sour. Like soup, but none you'd serve company. The job is slow, smelly, and deeply meditative. As the hides bob gently in their barky bath, you lean on your paddle, the steam rising like a mist of old secrets. That's when you almost start to forget where you are. The sun paints golden streaks along the rafters. The lapping of water, the far-off call of a church bell, and the deep, earthy aroma of bark all create something strangely comforting. You begin to see how someone could get used to this, not in a spa day sense, but in the quiet pride of making something with your hands. Something useful, something lasting. Of course, the moment doesn't last, because just then someone yells about a hide gone missing, possibly eaten by dogs. But that is tomorrow's problem. Tonight, let's rest. For even the medieval world had sundown stars and the ever-reliable excuse that one's shift ended at candle dimming. And as the tannery closes its creaky shutters, our journey carries on to an even stranger corner of medieval industry, where safety regulations are still just a rumor, and soapy water means someone's probably getting fined, while the morning sun spilled lazily over sleepy thatched rooftops and hens yawned, figuratively, in their coops. Our noble tanner was already elbows deep in something unpleasant. Again. Now, if tanning were just about dipping leather into tea and humming softly, perhaps it wouldn't have earned such a legendary stench. But no. This chapter, brace yourself gently, is about the heart of the operation, the pits. Imagine, if you will, a backyard-sized mosaic of sunken vats, like a medieval ice cube tray, only filled with, not ice. Stuffed into these pits, in various stages of frothy fermentation, are undiluted concoctions your nose would sue you for recognizing. Because while Italy had vino, a tanner's wine was made of water, lime, pigeon droppings, and decomposing animal bits. Salute. Let's start with the lime pits. No, not the zesty green fruit. Lime, as in calcium hydroxide. A powder so caustic it could strip the hair off your dreams. The hides first had to bathe here for a duration that seems cruel to both time and hide. The goal? Break down the collagen just enough, loosen up the hairs, and prep the skin for the true horrors to come. Once the soaking was done, the tanner would lift the wretched thing from the pit, by hand, because gloves were for courtly types and miraculous relics, and stretch it out on a sloping wooden beam called a beaming bench. There, using a curved tool known as a fleshing knife, they scraped away any remaining hair and flesh. Heavy, rhythmic scraping, the kind that was half craft and half upper body workout. Think CrossFit, but with fewer protein shakes and more pestilence. Those thin white hairs you find on a bar of factory soap today. Yeah, let's just not compare. Oh, and did I mention the tanner almost certainly had cuts on his hands? Shallow little nicks from daily toil, just open enough to welcome bacteria with the warm hospitality of a Tudor innkeeper. With no concept of germ theory and a diet rich in rye bread and prayer, this was the occupational hazard equivalent of juggling angry squirrels. Once shaved nearly bald, the moisture-heavy hides needed their personalities exterminated. Enter the dung pits. Yes, actual excrement. Pigeon droppings and dog poop, blended into slurry and left to achieve the type of chemical reaction that sent critics gagging. These pits were crucial. The ammonia in dung helped soften the hides further and open the pores for treatments. Think of it as nature's unrequested skincare routine. Now, every town had its tanner, and every tanner had to collect donations. Dog owners were often encouraged to scoop and deliver the goods, decades before the humble plastic bag. Some towns even paid children a few pennies to scurry about collecting the mess, which is probably the origin of the phrase dirty job, but someone's got to do it. Or, alternatively, medieval side hustle. With the hides now fully tenderized, one might say emotionally broken, they were ready for actual tanning. The tanning agents came from barks rich in tannins, oak, chestnut, or hemlock. These enormous vats looked suspiciously like witches' cauldrons, but lacked the whimsy. The hides soaked in these infusions for months. Not days, not weeks, months. It was less a process and more a seasonal relationship. And yet, for all its grime and gloop, this was a skilled trade. A good tanner could judge pH by eye, know when a hide was ready by how it squished between the fingers, and survive years of toxin exposure fueled solely by browned, ailey, and eyebrow grit. There were no quality control inspectors beyond your own reputation and the noses of your neighbors, who by now had either grown accustomed or quietly moved to the edge of town. Of course, the tanners themselves weren't always treated with equal parts respect and ostracism. They were essential and yet reminded everyone of death. At festivals, they might still be welcomed, so long as they kept their personal breeze downwind. But life near the pits wasn't all dung and drudgery. There was camaraderie in suffering. Apprentices sang songs while scraping hides. Tradesmen traded gossip over reeking barrels, and the local cat population enjoyed an endless buffet of discarded bits. Simple pleasures, really. So as we bid adieu to the steaming vats and the tireless souls who tended them, you can relax, knowing your own busy day didn't involve lime burns, composted pigeon droppings, or hand-stripping a cow into couture. Let's quietly tiptoe away from the pits now, shall we? There's something waiting elsewhere in the workshop, less pungent perhaps, but no less peculiar. A process involving ancient trade secrets, knots, and, believe it or not, a fair amount of chewing. By now, you've gotten a fair whiff of the medieval tannery, metaphorically we hope. But if your mind is still pleasantly wandering along those muddy lanes, let us peer a bit closer at an element both central and, in its own way, wondrously weird. The tanning bark. No, not bark as in bow wow, though early mornings might have included a few territorial dogs yapping at leather-clad apprentices. This bark came from trees, particularly oak, and it held within its fibrous veins a little magic molecule called tannin. Tannin was the secret source of the tanning world. Not exactly something you drizzle on a salad, but certainly the stuff that could turn a soft, pliable hide into something more durable, less odorous, and slightly less likely to attract flies. Think of tannin as nature's duct tape. It binds, it toughens, and it preserves. To medieval tanners, a big sack of oak bark was as precious as gold dust, or at least slightly more pleasant to smell. They'd harvest it mostly in springtime, when the sap was high and the bark peeled more easily. Stripped dutifully from young oak trees by woodsmen, likely grumbling about their splinters. This bark would then be dried, chopped, and ground with methods that could range from very tedious to positively backbreaking. Sometimes, a water-powered mill would take up the grinding task, with a great wooden wheel creaking away, crushing bark into fibrous dust, known charmingly as tan. Like a magical seasoning, this tan would then be mounded liberally into vats of hides and urine and brains, or whatever marinade the tanner had on hand. The result? A long, slow soak in a mixture that could take months to complete its alchemy. Hides were moved from weaker solutions to stronger ones, bit by bit, like a very unpleasant spa treatment that lasted anywhere from 6 months to a year. Yes, it was slow, but you'd be surprised what patience you can muster when you don't have email, instant noodles, or TikTok. As you drift into the image of row upon row of great wooden vats, each one cradling a limbless skin in an earthy, acidic stew, it's almost meditative, like a forest in miniature. Each vat is a tub of bark, wood, and thyme. And in the silence of that wooded imagery, imagine a young tanner's apprentice assigned the profoundly tedious task of stirring the hides. He reaches in with a wooden paddle, prodding gently, like one might turn a dumpling in broth. Not too fast. You wouldn't want to tear the dermis. Not too slow, or risk missing your 14th century productivity quota. Of course, this bark bath was only part of the journey. If you were a really high-end tanner, say, one operating in a major medieval city, you might also experiment with other tannin-imbued substances, sumac, myrobalan, gall nuts. Exotic imports sometimes arrived with trade caravans and were prized additions to the tanner's toolkit. Gall nuts, for example, are bulbous little growths found on oak trees, created when certain insects lay eggs in the bark. Yes, they're the insect equivalent of tiny tree tumors, but in the tanning world, they were glorious lumps of tannic acid. Science. This was chemistry before Bunsen burners. It was art before textbooks. And it was predictably messy. The smell alone would cling to your clothes, your hair, and occasionally your personality. Yet somehow, it worked. In these pungent stews, leather slowly transformed, from pale, fleshy flaps to rich brown hides, strong enough to become boots, belts, book covers, or the overly elaborate hat worn by the town bailiff. And still, the bark did its work without fanfare. Quietly, it turned rot into resilience, death into durability. You could say it was the alchemist of the forest, lending its strength to an entirely different life form without asking anything in return, except perhaps for your olfactory dignity. So the next time you see a stately oak tree, perhaps tip an invisible hat to its inner tannins. Vital to medieval trade, unintentionally foundational to modern chemistry, all while never once demanding credit, unlike Nigel the apprentice, who will not stop mentioning the time he stirred every vat by himself during the Lent of 1376. But we digress. As night presses further in, and your mind gently curls like a warm hide settling into a bark bath, we continue on, not far, not rushed, just calmly downstream to the next stage, where drying racks, wind, and a surprising amount of shouting await. By now, you may already suspect that a medieval tannery was not the place to take your date on a quiet Friday evening. Unless your date had a deep appreciation for animal hides, lye-based chemistry, and the open display of entrails in various stages of fermentation, romance was not found among the vats of lime-soaked hair sludge. Not unless the flickering torchlight on a bubbling soup of goat skins stole your heart in ways that candlelight and sonnets never could. But let us direct our wandering thoughts to a task so humble and so pungently important that it deserved its own grumbled curses from apprentice to master. The process of dehairing, also lovingly known in the trade as scraping the truth out of the hide. Once the hides were dragged in and sufficiently soaked in lime water, an appealing medieval cocktail of chalky white solution designed specifically to loosen the hair with a vengeance, they were hauled out, stiff and bloated, like uncooked dumplings left too long in a cauldron. And if that image doesn't lull you peacefully into dreams, I'm not sure what will. With hides slumped limply over a long wooden beam known as a scraping horse, the tanning apprentice, typically a lad with few prospects and even fewer nasal nerves, would take up his scraping knife. The knife was curved like a smile and as serious as a sermon. Gently, deliberately, and with a rhythm cultivated over long hours spent in fetid shade, he would begin, scraping off hair, flesh remnants, and the occasional surprise maggot colony, waving politely from the subdermal suburbs. It was an art form of sorts. The apprentice had to apply just enough pressure to remove the unwanted debris, but not so much that he punctured the hide. A single careless gouge would subtract copper coins from his wage, and those coins were already few and usually battered beyond recognition. In many towns, they paid tanners in smell-proof housing and the occasional cabbage, which hardly made accidental scoring of hides worth it. Now, imagine rows of these scraping stations, each man or boy bumping elbows with another, forming a kind of grunt-infused orchestra set to the tempo of blade on leather. The sound was oddly soothing, a wet percussion of squelch, scrape, flick, like a medieval ASMR video. If you were the sort who found relaxation in viscera, the removed hair wasn't discarded. Oh no. Waste not, want not, especially before indoor toilets were trendy. Horsehair and animal bristles were collected for brushes, wigs, even mattress stuffing in the homes of people who hadn't asked too many questions. And the fleshings, the stringy offcuts of meat still clinging to the skin, were sometimes mixed with other scraps to make dog food, or, on harder days, dubious human food. If you ever wondered whether a medieval meat pie might contain a hint of mystery, this is where that mystery began. It helped, though, that most tanneries were located outside town walls, downwind and delightfully isolated, less for the tanner's sake, more for everyone else's. It wasn't personal, it was aromatic. Once the hair was gone and the hide lay smooth and eerily pale, the leather was ready to move on to its next grim adventure, the soaking of souls, otherwise known as the baiting process. But for now, our poor apprentice, sleeves rolled high and hands raw from lye, would stretch his back, take a moment to soak in the warm stink of bubbling skin juice, and perhaps think, just for a moment, about joining the monastery instead. Silence, incense, and celibacy seemed like a wonderfully odorless compensation. And so, under the faint light of a long-forgotten sunbeam slipping across a vat-rimmed floor, the world of scraping hides churned on, equal parts intimacy and horror, craftsmanship and compost, leather-bound kings and cobblers alike. Yet it began here, with rhythmic scraping and dreams slowly peeled away like hair from lime-softened skin. Now, with our hide hairless and our humour intact, we drift gently toward the next step of our journey, where barting isn't what it sounds like, but somehow smells even worse. As twilight settles gently over the thatched rooftops of a medieval village, the scent of wet earth and hearth smoke curls into the evening air. But if you follow your nose just a bit too far downwind, you might catch a far less poetic perfume, the telltale bouquet of a tannery mid-process. And if you've been with us this long, you will not be surprised to know that it only gets more aromatic from here. Tonight we find ourselves on the threshold of a vital yet somewhat aromatic operation, the soaking pits. This chapter, dear listener, is all about the art of marinade, not for your dinner, unfortunately, but for your cowhide. Now, allow us a moment to talk about what these pits were exactly. Imagine several waist-deep stone basins, aligned like giant soup pots in a strange chef's outdoor kitchen. Into each went hides, and into each also went a carefully cultivated cocktail of medieval horrors. Primarily human urine, occasionally animal dung, and sometimes quicklime, a trifecta chosen not for their scent, but for their chemical enthusiasm. The hides would soak for days, sometimes even a solid week, in this pungent slurry. And in case you were wondering, yes, there was someone responsible for stirring it. Welcome to the esteemed position of the tanner's apprentice. If you've ever had an entry-level job where your main duty was to get familiar with the process, count yourself lucky it didn't involve wading ankle-deep into communal ammonia while chasing a floating cow leg. The purpose of this rather aromatic dunking process was to loosen hair and flesh from the hide, a preparatory spa day, if you will, though the cows would probably disagree. Hair needed to be removed not only for aesthetics, but to ensure the leather wouldn't trap moisture and bacteria. Leather, after all, needed to endure decades of wear, from tugging oxen to wild tavern brawls involving breakaway jerkin collars. Removing that hair was next, and while you might imagine some sort of elegant trimming implement, let me introduce you instead to the beaming pride of many a tanner's toolkit, the fleshing knife, a curved blade dragged methodically, if not lovingly, over the hide, scraping away the soft tissues like spreading very unfortunate butter on very unfortunate toast. On good days, the flesh would come away smoothly. On bad days, well, let's just say the apprentice might head home with a bit of job in his shoes, and possibly between his teeth, depending on wind direction. Oh, and speaking of wind, these stages didn't just happen in the fragrant quiet of isolated workshops. The soaking pits were frequently placed at the edges of villages' shore, but wind doesn't respect fences or zoning laws. A strong easterly breeze during market day could quickly turn the square into a symphony of grimaces. Interestingly, these very scents acted as medieval advertisements. A truly effective tannery had a recognizable radius. If you walk past it without involuntarily holding your breath, the work wasn't being done properly. That's right, smells weren't just accepted. They were performance indicators, metrics if you will. As you drift deeper into thought, or perhaps simply float above the potent stench, imagine the daily rhythm of these medieval artisans, rising early to inspect hides, donning aprons so stained they seemed to come from a Renaissance painting abandoned in the rain, and greeting neighbors with cheerful nods that made those neighbors promptly cross the street. There's comfort in knowing that even the most medieval of workplaces had its rituals. A bucket of lye here, a complaint about foot fungus there, maybe even a rash-related joke or two. Because at the end of the day, whether you're curing hide or curing boredom, a little gallows humor goes a long way, especially when half your job involves gallows-grade smells. And so, as the moon rises quietly over the sleepy tannery yards and the soaking pits glisten under pale starlight, like the world's least romantic reflecting pools. We leave these tender operations behind, the hides nearly ready for their next transformative phase. The apprentice discreetly washing his hands for the 7th time this evening, and the wind mercifully shifting westward. Soon, we'll follow those same hides as they move from softening slurries towards something a little more refined. The journey continues, one pungent step at a time. Most of us these days wouldn't last 5 minutes in a world without artisanal oat milk or streaming services that ask nothing of us but a soft nod to continue watching. So imagine the raw courage, or the complete lack of a better option, it took to spend your days waist-deep in liquefied cow gizzards, elbow-greased into rawhide, and entirely nose-blind to the stench of 14th century productivity. By now, you might already suspect that medieval tanneries weren't exactly spa resorts, but hold on to your flaxen nightcap, because we haven't yet talked about the soundtrack of this particular career path, the surprisingly musical complaints of decomposing organic matter. Yes, while the role of the medieval tanner may seem purely tactile, scrape, soak, scrape, it was also something of an olfactory and auditory adventure, one full of squelches, sighs, and hints of existential murmuring from slowly rotting hides. A regular Tuesday, really. Let us drift now into the tannery yard, a wide, muddy courtyard dotted with stone vats and thick wooden beams dressed in drying pelts. The walls are dark from age and use and the occasional mysterious splatter. Rain, when it came, did nothing to cleanse the place. It only stirred the stew. Tanners had no need for clocks. Time was measured in hide soaked, in meals missed, because your hands were knee-deep in what was, at best, lukewarm urine. Take a moment now to reflect on the true resilience of a people who used human pee as part of their professional toolkit. Gathered daily from public contributions, what polite society might today call donations, it was poured into vats and used to soften hides before scraping. And not just any scraping. This involved the aptly named flesh side of the skin, which had to be stripped of all its remaining tissue. The hair, loosened by lime water and hope, would be scraped away with knives along curving beams called scrapers or fleshing boards. If you're picturing a full-body exfoliation service, don't. Picture instead a never-ending round of tug-of-war, except your opponent is a soggy piece of dead cow. Now, tanners weren't exactly the neighborhood's favorite bunch. With the ever-present stench and the risk of contagious diseases, thanks to the occasional misstep involving rotting flesh, they were often given their own districts outside city centres. In places like York or Bruges, you might find the tanning district conveniently located downriver, ensuring that all waste floated away to someone else's problem. But with their isolation came a curious upside: freedom. Tanners operated with a sort of rough independence. They might be looked upon with mild horror, but they weren't shackled by the same strict trade laws as, say, silversmiths or bakers. No one wanted to regulate you too closely, when just standing near you could bring on a light swoon. There were tools, of course, sharpened edge knives, wooden paddles, vats, especially designed so a full-grown man could stir skins like the world's worst soup. Leather processing was furthered by dog's dung, known politely in the trade as pure. Yes, someone somewhere renamed it pure to make dealing with it just slightly more bearable. It didn't help. Pure was used as an enzyme-rich softener. Think of it as a primitive conditioner. Hair, meet medieval Pantene. The catch? It required sailors and innkeepers and little children to tote buckets about town, scooping up canine contributions left in the streets. Before you feel horrified, do remember, that's why the wages were marginally higher in the tannery business. Danger pay, if you will, plus unlimited access to knee-high boots. In spite of the revolting working conditions, tanners provided something crucial. Leather was not a luxury, it was a necessity, used for shoes, belts, bookbindings, armor, even the seats noble behinds sat upon for long council meetings. Without this slippery brotherhood of hide wranglers, the world would have gone barefoot and spineless, quite literally. As dust settles over our imagined tannery yard, the day's final hides have been hung, dripping maliciously into the puddles below. A mangy tannery dog, quite possibly named Pure, trots past with something indeterminate clenched in its enthusiastic jaw. A tanner steps back through the threshold of his humble abode, where even his own cat has retreated from the bouquet he carries home daily. Soon, the town bell will toll, the nightjars will sing, and even the tanners, who might never quite smell of lavender, will lay down their weary heads and dream of softer, cleaner centuries. But before we follow them off into the night, let us turn our gaze towards something equally fragrant, if far more refined, the perfumers. Because if you've spent your day slipping around in ammoniated stew, nothing says redemption like a vial of rosewater and secrets. By now, you may be starting to suspect that working in a medieval tannery was not exactly a fragrant path to knighthood. But allow me to escort you, softly, oh so softly, deeper into the steaming belly of the beast. Let's talk water, or more accurately, the stylish lack of modern plumbing. A medieval tannery was, you see, a thirsty operation. Water was needed in great quantities for soaking, washing, rinsing, re-soaking, re-rinsing, and the occasional desperate attempt to scrub the stench of liquefied pigeon droppings from one's boots. Tanners established their smelly kingdoms near rivers and streams, not for the scenic views, mind you, but simply because there was no other way to rinse endless cowhide and ambition in a pre-piped world. And while modern zoning regulations discourage dumping, well, gross things into rivers, medieval communities had a somewhat looser interpretation of environmental protection. Think of it less as polluting and more as contributing to the local aromatic ecosystem. Yes, the tannery upstream made the water a bit tangy, but consider the practical upside. Nobody swam, so drownings plummeted. Now the water source wasn't just vital for soaking hides, it was indispensable for people too. Tanners lived, worked, and occasionally napped beside the same water they and their hides shared. Is that a glug of water from the wooden bucket, or a particularly well-hydrated rat? Who can say? One cannot discuss water in a tannery without a particular step. Let's call it the soaking the future purse in a vat of memories. Before hides were tanned, they were soaked for several days in large open vats. And these vats, filled with urine, animal brains, lime, or a charming cocktail of all three, were stirred by hand, or, if someone misplaced the stirring stick, by bare foot. Yes, that's right. There were poorly paid men, often apprentices, boys barely into their teens, who would climb into vats and stomp the hides like medieval winemakers of funk. While the noble vintner danced upon grapes to birth a wine, the tanner's assistant squished his toes through liquefied flesh to ensure a future belt would be supple. These were not quick soaks. A hide might lounge luxuriously in these concoctions for many sunrises, wrinkling and fermenting like a leather soup. And while we gently sip our bedside tea here in the present, it's worth remembering that the worker's daily foot bath may have been at least 40% cow byproduct. Your bubble bath has never looked better, has it? Let us now imagine the tanner himself, He rises at dawn, his clothes stained every shade of despair, trudging through the morning mist to his vats. A raven squawks overhead, not in warning, but perhaps out of sheer sympathy. He rolls up his sleeves, picks up the wooden paddle, and pokes the surface of the steeping hides with the solemn focus of a man stirring an unspeakable soup. But importantly, this wasn't done in isolation. Tanners were part of a community, though a community that preferred they be located very far away from everyone else. Medieval towns often dictated that tanneries exist on the outskirts, beyond the walls, past the baker, the blacksmith, and probably just beyond the "Here be dragons" sign. Not because tanners were uncivilized, mind you, but simply because you could smell them half a mile out, and that was if the wind was feeling charitable. Their homes were near their work, which meant you could tell a tanner's family by their resilient nasal passages and a wardrobe dominated by ale brown and regrettable beige. Still, among themselves, tanners formed tight circles. They passed down tricks for faster soaking, special bark recipes, and maybe even an old trusted foot-stirring technique honed through decades of squelching experience. Apprentices moved up through ranks slowly, first learning to scrape, then to soak, and eventually to tan. Becoming a master tanner took years, time, practice, and the humble ability to suppress your gag reflex. They may not have worn armor or jousted for love, but they were craftsmen, hardened by boots full of brine and spirits forged in stink. Imagine, under the moon's soft glow, a young apprentice lying on a straw mattress near the river. His feet sore, his tunic stiff with unknown substances, and the scent of 20 soaked hides nestled lightly in his clothes like an unwelcome perfume. He closes his eyes, dreams of someday having his own shop, and perhaps a window. Tomorrow, he'll learn how to handle alum, one of the few tanning agents that didn't smell like digestive revenge. A little sparkle in an otherwise earthy profession. And speaking of alum, you might want to take a deep, gentle breath now. The air is about to become a touch more refined, in the smoky stillness of a pre-dawn medieval village, when all is dew and distant roosters muttering half-hearted oaths to the rising sun. The tanners are already at it. Shuffling through shadows and something stickier, they are the early risers you never want to meet. Because while the baker might greet the morning with the warm perfume of bread, the tanner greets it with something far less appetizing. And this time, our olfactory adventures settle on the unsung tool of the medieval tanner's trade, the lime pit. Ah yes, the lime pit. Calm, unassuming, and deadlier to your wardrobe than any spilled goblet of mead. Imagine, if you will, a stone-lined basin brimming with a murky fluid, made from water and calcium oxide, or quicklime, as history prefers to call it, when it's feeling ominous. It fizzes mildly when first stirred, like a sinister sort of lemonade. But don't be fooled. This is no refreshing bath. It's more like a chemical divorce lawyer. Its entire job is to dissolve the relationships that bind flesh, hair, and fat to hide. Newly acquired animal skins, still sporting remnants of their former owners, were flopped unceremoniously into these caustic baths. There, they would soak anywhere from several days to over a week, depending on the season, the tanner's patience, and whether the skins were sheep, fairly cooperative, or pig, surprisingly stubborn. Now, by day 3 in this spa for the unruly dead, the hides begin to balloon slightly, bloated with whatever ancient secrets they've begun to surrender. The hair slips off in patches, like a well-worn acquaintance ready to move on, and a nauseating froth quietly collects on the surface. In other words, peak tanning action. Retrieving the soaking hides was no dignified procedure either. Tanners waded in with long wooden paddles, or, when the day was especially difficult, with their arms up to the elbow in memories that stank like wet tombstones and despair. There were no gloves, only a shrug, a wince, and a prayer to whatever saint tolerated limb rot. This process wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Quicklime is notoriously unfriendly to skin, dissolving tissue with the zeal of a bad breakup. Many an apprentice tanner ended up with burns, boils, or an inexplicably patchy beard, the result of splashes that left chemical kisses on their face. But wounds were part of the job, as were calluses thick enough to offend a carpenter. You might assume quite reasonably that after the whole dunk and dissolve ordeal, the hides were rinsed delicately with some herbal concoction and dried on lines in the sunshine. You sweet, dreamy optimist. In truth, once your hide was good and pickled, the next step was the fleshing knife, a wickedly curved blade mounted on a beam, used to scrape off any stubborn bits of goo still clinging to the leather. Picture a cross between woodworking and very determined butchery, conducted by someone whose personal scent would make a buzzard flinch. As tanners hunched over their scraping benches, rhythmic schlops echoing in concert with occasional muttered curses, they were often accompanied by colonies of flies who'd mistaken the place for a summer resort. The flies were wrong, of course, but you couldn't blame them. The air was thick with enough organic promise to confuse even the sharpest insect. But even amid this mess, a broth of lime and labour, of rotted hair and resolute resolve, the tanners found a sort of strange satisfaction. Their work, maligned and marginal, was essential. Without them, no saddles for the knights, no boots for the blacksmiths, and no belts for the waistlines of petty lords who had feasted too aggressively on pie. By evening, after a long day stirring lime and defying every known sense, the tanner would slouch home, clothes stiff with mysterious crust, hands raw but oddly proud, perhaps pausing only to swat a fly or two who'd come along for the ride. And so, the lime pit, that quiet little corner of medieval nastiness, sits bubbling in the background of history, an acidic testament to human grit, and perhaps the worst bathwater in Europe for some 400 years. In the distance, a breeze stirs, carrying with it the promise of the next phase in the eternal journey from hide to handbag. For once, the hair is gone and the flesh surrendered. The skin still needs something far more. Organic, something that involves both animals and their digestive processes. Specifically what comes after digestion. But that, dear listener, is a delight we'll leave to next time. As twilight settles over our imagined medieval village, a village you now know perhaps a little too intimately, let us wander away, ever so gingerly, from the vats of lime and dung, and turn our soft leather sandals down the alley to meet a craftsman whose job was equal parts necessity and nasal assault, the tanner's apprentice. Now, the word apprentice may summon up romantic visions of eager boys with wide eyes and bigger dreams, perhaps dreaming of becoming a master in a dignified guild, or catching the eye of a blacksmith's lovely daughter. But in the tannery world, an apprentice was closer in job description to enthusiastic victim. Before we drift too far from our olfactory nightmare, we must remember the tanning process relied heavily on the youngest and most impressionable noses. That's right. It was often the apprentices who fetched the water, stirred the vats, and yes, stood in them. Historically, human urine was collected, usually in strategically placed pots around towns, and sold to tanners. An enterprising apprentice might be sent door to door asking for donations. a kind of medieval GoFundMe, with less funding and more peeing. You might be wondering, how does this young, sweet-faced lad of 13 find himself knee-deep in a blend of fermenting hides and defiant odours? He likely didn't choose it. You see, tradesmen had a habit of inheriting apprentices from family friends or desperate neighbours, and once selected, an apprentice often signed away 7 years of their life, 7 glorious, nauseating years. A legal contract, often sealed not with a handshake, but with a firm whiff of reality. These apprentices lived with their masters, slept in cramped quarters, and ate whatever had been deemed less interesting than leather. They were up at dawn, shooing away stray dogs attracted by the rich aroma of tanning pits. And if you've never been tackled by a flock of enthusiastic village mutts before sunrise, count yourself among the blessed. But not all was suffering. Well, most of it was, but not all. For instance, once in a while, festivals rolled through town, and during these mirthful moments, even the Tannery boys were allowed to wash their tunics and parade along cobbled streets, waving to the baker's daughter, who tried not to recoil. There were even competitions, yes, honest-to-goodness contests, to see who could scrape a hide the fastest or withstand the longest without fainting during high lime season. Deep down, behind soot-smudged cheeks and calloused hands, apprentices learned valuable wisdom, like how to determine hide type by smell alone, or which dog breeds produced the richest deposits. These weren't exactly resume skills, but in their world, they were badges of pride. The communal aspect of it all was surprisingly touching. There was camaraderie among those who scraped hides together at dusk, whistling off-key songs and inventing new curses for the flies. A shared horror, really, binds people in unexpected ways, and within those foul-smelling walls, lore was passed from master to apprentice, like a cherished family recipe. If said recipe required soaking in fermented pigeon droppings, the master tanner, often a crusty fellow with a beard that edged suspiciously into absorbing tool, wasn't always cruel. In fact, in his own aromatic way, he could be deeply instructive. He'd teach the apprentice how to read the weather in a hide's firmness, or tell if a batch had gone wrong by the fly's patterns of flight. It's true, history forgot some of these men, but nature remembered them, usually by staying downwind. After months or years of practice, something beautiful began to happen. Our young apprentice developed an uncanny sixth sense for leather. He could touch a supple scrap and surmise the age of the cow, the climate it came from, and, most impressively, what sort of shoes it would someday become. While you slept under goose feather duvets, this young hide whisperer worked beneath torchlight, his hands moving over the grain, dreaming not of escape, but of mastery. And before long, the apprentice ceased to wrinkle his nose. His shoulders grew broad, his fingers deft, and slowly he became not a survivor of Tannery life, but a quiet hero in the fabric of his medieval town. Yet, just as his story moves forward, up cobbled steps toward journeyman status, our own path must wind along. There's still much to see, tucked just beside the straps and scraps, just past the curing shed, where shadows stretch long, and another peculiar job waits among whispers of oak bark and air thick with the scent of forgotten centuries. A gentle fog clings to the thatched rooftops of a narrow village lane. Somewhere beyond the mists, a rooster considers crowing, changes its mind, and settles back into a warm pile of coop feathers. The village tannery, however, does not wait for crowing. Its business is conducted by odor rather than hour, and as the sun stretches its golden fingers toward the earth, the tanner prepares for another day of medieval skincare, by which we mean the skin of cows, goats, sheep, and occasionally the unfortunate neighborhood cat, although that's a whole different tale. Today, we step into the quiet horror, nay, the waking scented nightmare, of the tanner's most iconic tool, the lime pit. And no, dear listener, this isn't the refreshing green citrus you squeeze into a goblet of mead on Midsummer's Eve. This lime is calcium hydroxide, a caustic, chalky slurry lurking in pits of stone or wood, finger-painted with the murky hues of old rainwater, spoiled ambition, and cowhide dreams. The purpose of this grotesque tango with chemistry was simple. Lime breaks down natural fats, protein, and most importantly, hair. In the spirit of rustic efficiency, a raw animal hide would be dumped into one of these pecan pools and left to stew until the hair began to slip off, like a poorly made wig in a gusty market square. Slipping the hair was the goal. Your nose slipping off your face was the unwelcome side effect. Immersed in the warm fog of this medieval morning, imagine, if you will, a tanner smeared in what cannot be described as anything but scent-based betrayal. His apron is stiff as a board, his fingernails have eroded from exposure, and his eyebrows exist purely out of stubbornness. He wields a two-handled blade called a fleshing knife, with all the finesse of a pastry chef gone rogue, vigorously scraping hair, bark, and regrettable decisions off the hide. This process, called beaming, takes place atop something regrettably named a beam, which is essentially a curved wooden log perched at just the right angle to ensure both maximum physical strain and minimum lumbar support. It's important to note that medieval hide workers, despite their proximity to aggression and bodily decay, were not villains. They were artisans of alchemy, rotting skins into riches. The lime pit, noxious though it was, played a pivotal role in transforming an otherwise floppy, fur-covered future compost pile into a smooth, workable canvas for leather. You see, fashion was very much alive, even if the cows weren't. Once scraped clean of hair, the hide still had a long road ahead. But here, in this chapter, we sit with the patient lime pit, fizzing quietly, doing its perilous work while the village trundles about nearby, blissfully unaware or perhaps nose blind to the olfactory poetry wafting their way. It's almost easy to forget that, in this same century, perfume was made by distilling flowers, and tanners were distilling something else entirely. The scent of a lime pit lingered not just on one's hands, but seemingly in one's soul. Medieval laws often forbade tanners from working within city walls, claiming public health concerns, but likely just not wanting every dinner to taste faintly of alkali and despair. To protect themselves, tanners might slather their hands in animal fat before beginning the day's labor, not because it helped, but because once your skin was covered in lard, somehow things just felt right again. A little barrier between flesh and caustic goo, between man and medieval extremity. And so, we leave the tanner for now. Sleeves rolled up, arms deep in the lime pit, skin modestly sizzling, and part of a tradition older than most empires. The hides slosh quietly, hair drifting up like ghostly riverweed. Outside, children play. Cartwheels creak. A meadowlark sings. Inside the pit, time dissolves almost as swiftly as flesh. Now that our journey has scraped beneath the skin, so to speak, we might next turn our eyes to a different, equally unruly medium. One that involves actual excrement and a surprising penchant for pigeon droppings. But don't fret, it's all perfectly historical. Imagine, if you will, the mid-morning hush of a medieval town. interrupted only by the soft shuffle of wooden clogs over cobblestones and the occasional bray of a market donkey who, to be quite honest, sounds like he has opinions. And tucked somewhere behind the row of houses with sagging thatch and suspiciously low doorways is a tannery, a place so pungent it could knock your socks off, if socks had yet been invented with any softness at all. Here, in the heart of 14th century industry, we find a man named Elias, a professional tanner, whose hands are as leathery as the wares he produces. He squints into the rising sun, which does nothing to warm the thick, damp apron clinging to him like an unfortunate second skin. His son, a curly-haired, sore-nosed boy named Niels, is learning the family trade, though he hasn't yet learned how to stop gagging. Today's task was a noble one, softening several hides that had steeped overnight in a bath of stale urine. Yes, urine. Somewhere along the winding path of human ingenuity, someone discovered that soaking hides in ammonia-rich liquids made them easier to work with. And what's full of ammonia and conveniently plentiful wherever humans are? Precisely. In medieval tanning, the solution to many problems was apparently more bodily than technological. The collected chamber pot donations from local households, often gratefully given in exchange for a small coin, or more often, out of sheer misery, were brought in each morning by the piss collectors. Their job title, though never officially engraved on a plaque, was arguably more honest than most modern resumes. And if you're wondering, yes, there were some who grew rather proud of their particular blend. Medieval bragging rights came in stranger forms than Instagram likes. Once the hides had achieved the requisite level of uric dampness, and that's a phrase no one should expect to hear before breakfast, they were pummeled underfoot by apprentices like Niels. Yes, barefoot. Let that soak in, unlike the leather, which did not soak in nicely unless thoroughly trod upon by increasingly grumpy adolescents. It's a wonder they didn't revolt. But to be fair, they were too tired. The next step involved scraping. Armed with implements that resembled something between a butter knife and an overdue dentist's tool, Elias would scrape off remaining flesh and hair with rhythmic dedication. Over and over, skin on skin. It was a disconcerting sort of intimacy, really, if you think about it. But perhaps it's best not to. Leather didn't become supple and usable simply by being scrubbed and stomped. It had to be deloused, delimbed, and destank, often using lime and dog dung. Yes, dog dung. Another gift from the animal kingdom, harnessed in the name of fashion and functionality. Having dogs around wasn't just for guarding your vegetable patch. Their leavings were, how shall we say it, essential supplies, and not gently scooped up with biodegradable bags. No, young Niels would collect it in buckets. Buckets. At this point, you might be wondering, how did anyone tolerate this? Why didn't the townsfolk rise up and say, perhaps we should keep the tanning district a little farther out of town? Well, they did, eventually. By law, tanneries were often required to operate outside the main population centres, near rivers, because water was essential, both to clean the hides and to wash away everything else. But imagine, just briefly, drifting down that very river in your dreams, the soft ripple of water, the creak of a little wooden bridge overhead, and the far-off sound of a tanner's hammer rhythmically tapping a hide into submission. Thomas Aquinas once said that nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses, but we do hope he was wearing boots. Despite the grim ingredients and blistered hands, leather was gold in the medieval economy. You couldn't fight a war or make a saddle or write a Bible without it. the parchment in your book, processed hide, the straps that held up your breeches, leather, the scabbard for your uber-flamboyant sword, leather. It was the duct tape of the era, stinky but indispensable. And so, under the lazy buzz of flies and the stoic stare of a cow who perhaps recognized someone she once knew, the medieval tannery hummed on, a world of scuffs and stains, alchemy via excrement, and ambition stewed in might-have-been soup. Somewhere nearby, church bells toll the hour, and Elias wipes his brow with a kind of kerchief you should never sniff. Young Neil sighs. The hides, soft and ready, flap gently on the drying racks, swaying like tired flags in a breeze that does little to improve the overall stench. But there, just beyond the tannery yard, something new waits. A curious figure approaching with a different skill, a different smell, and, to everyone's relief, a different pair of shoes. In the soft, golden haze of yet another damp medieval morning, we shuffle back to the tanner's yard, our noses now slightly desensitized, our boots depressingly resigned. The stench, still rich, robust, and unapologetically manufactured from 1,000 unspeakable things. But today, we're not so much wrinkling our noses as craning our necks. Because now, dear listener, we step away from the pits and pelts and turn our dreamy gaze to something altogether romantic and deeply counterintuitive, the curious, smelly role of the medieval tanner in the world of high fashion. Yes, fashion. It may astonish you to learn that every velvet-clad noble swirling dramatically through castle halls owed at least part of their flair to the quiet grind of the tanner's craft. From rugged riding boots to delicate leather gloves, it was the tanner who, amid fumes strong enough to knock over a reasonably healthy donkey, laid the groundwork for glamour. Of course, they didn't use the word glamour in the 13th century. That sort of magic was more likely to get you examined by a bishop with a suspicious squint. But style, that they had in spades. You see, leather was everywhere, belts and girdles and purses and book bindings. Even armor got a slice of the action. Before metal plate became the chivalric rage, knights strutted into battle wrapped in hardened leather cuirasses that made them feel and smell like mobile livestock. A freshly crafted belt from the tanner's hand was not just an accessory. It was a marvel of workmanship, boiled, dyed, tooled, and for the wealthy, sometimes studded with decorative metal, bells, yes, literal bells, and the occasional gemstone if you really believed your hips deserved attention. And speaking of that noble belt, it often came with buckles so beautifully intricate they would have made a modern minimalist designer weep openly into their oat milk. These items weren't just functional, they whispered status. Whispered, mind you, not shouted. Medieval fashion was subtle like that. Better to hint at wealth with supple shoes than trip over yourself in gold-threaded sleeves. But before these fine accessories ended up adorning dukes and duchesses, they had to be, of course, properly brown. Tan leather, true to its name, was the default. Dyes did exist, naturally, but achieving rich colors on leather required patience and no small amount of chemistry, most of which could probably kill you. To transform drab hide into royal purple or ecclesiastical red, tanners and dyers employed extravagant potions. Alum, iron salts, and plant dyes like woad or madder. These were carefully steeped into hides until the color set, or the hide disintegrated completely. Sometimes that happened. The color red, for example, often came from a concoction including crushed cochineal insects. Or if you were truly fancy, the entire dye bath might be blessed by a prayer and a goat, possibly in that order. But don't worry. If it didn't turn out, they could always slap it with beeswax and call it a rustic finish. Now, high-end leather goods were more likely to pass through the hands of a currier, a kind of post-tanning specialist who smoothed, shaped and oiled the leather until it gleamed like a nobleman's forehead at court. The currier's shop was the final stop before the leather was stitched into boots stiff enough to march you across France, or gloves tight enough to lose circulation in 3 fingers. Still, the humble tanner rarely got credit. His hands cracked and stained. He squinted at the sun from beneath a furrowed brow, knowing full well that someone in the castle town was swanning about in his handiwork, without even a nod in passing. Until, of course, one of their exquisite boots split dramatically during a dance. Then the tanner's name may have been hurled with great volume and very little context. Yet, despite the smell, the grime, and the ever-present threat of toe-gnawing vermin, tanners played an essential, if underappreciated role in the medieval economy. They turned dead animals into status symbols, lined pockets and bound books, and made the world a little more wearable, even while smelling like a wet dog in a thunderstorm. But as our twilight wander continues, cloaked in hide and dreams, we drift away from belts and boots, for there is still another layer of medieval leathercraft that awaits us, softer, finer, and altogether more delicate than anything you've yet inhaled. There's a certain romance to the idea of medieval craftsmanship, isn't there? The sort where a lone figure toils beneath the flickering glow of a tallow candle, shaping raw materials into goods of humble beauty. But if you dare to step beyond the figurative and toward the olfactory reality of this romantic image, specifically into a tannery, you'd find the scent considerably less poetic. And if you ever wondered how they kept the workers on task, let's just say it wasn't inspirational speeches or wellness retreats. It was the sheer impossibility of escaping with your dignity intact. We now drift, rather curiously, into one of the more obscure and eye-watering corners of the tanner's art, the practice of dog dung fermentation, charitably known in the period as puring. It might sound sophisticated, a bit like a fine cheese or an obscure French wine, but it involved slathering hides in warm, wet excrement to soften the leather and make it more pliable. Tiny enzymes did the heavy lifting, breaking down the collagen just enough to give the final product that luxurious, slightly soft give. Though no one in their right mind would call the process luxurious while it was happening. The dung was not random. You couldn't use just any old canine contribution. Ideally, you wanted it from a diet of meat and bones. Certain tanners, particularly in cities like York or Bristol, had strong feelings and even stronger opinions about which breeds offered the finest enzymatic ferment. In essence, a medieval leatherworker might detail his preferences as passionately as a modern barista extols their choice of coffee bean. Fetching the dung was itself a low-level profession, best assigned to apprentices, or, failing that, small boys, with a keen sense of adventure and an underdeveloped sense of smell. These collectors went street to street with little wooden spades and buckets, known colloquially as pure finders. And if that sounds quaint, let me assure you, it was not. Being a pure finder was less a career and more a series of unfortunate events dressed in a potato sack. Back at the tannery, the gathered bounty was diluted with warm water and swished into stone vats, into which the animal hides were then lowered and left to stew. The mixture had to be agitated regularly, which was carried out either with paddles or with actual feet. Yes, some workers slipped off their shoes and waded in barefoot. This was not for the squeamish or the proud, and certainly not for anyone hoping to enjoy lunch ever again. After a few days, in what could be politely called an aromatic marinade, the hides came out softened, smugly transformed in texture, but reeking as if they'd grown sentient and angry during their time in the pit. Rinsing came next, sometimes in the river, which did little for downstream communities hoping to do their laundry or, heaven forbid, drink. It was widely known that tanners had a particular odour. In towns with skilled trades, each guild might carry its own scent. Bakers smelled of yeast and warmth, blacksmiths of coal and oiled metal. But tanners, well, tanners were their own category. You didn't say hello to a tanner so much as brace. But here's where the story takes an oddly endearing turn. Despite all the muck and mire, they were proud of their work. Leather didn't just clothe people. It shielded soldiers, cradled books, shaped shoes, and bound medieval life in practical ways. And the tanners knew that no matter how nasty the journey, the destination was, well, doubly stitched and waterproofed. Laws protected their trade, and in many cities, they were relegated to the outskirts, near rivers, not because they were unloved, but because the smell of the process famously caused economic ripple effects in nearby fish markets. Fishmongers complained. Bakers filed petitions. At one point in late medieval Paris, the situation grew so fractious that civic leaders passed ordinances demanding tanners angle their vat pits away from prevailing winds. Of course, in time, technological elegance, or at the very least, the advent of less smelly chemicals, would make the dung vats obsolete. But for centuries, this terrible, necessary art persisted. Entire neighborhoods built their groaning reputations on it. And for those within it, the stink was simply part of the rhythm of days. As the scent of fermenting hides and barking dogs drifts slowly out of memory, replaced by softer dreams of wool, water wheels, and wool gathering, real and metaphorical, we tiptoe now beyond the tanning yard, toward a quieter craft, the subtle, ancient work of dyeing leather, and what wild plants and stranger things were stirred into its hues. In the tangled alleyways of medieval Europe, tucked behind market stalls and the gossiping glances of passing peasants, there lived a quiet dread. It was not a dragon, nor plague, nor tax collector, though each had its own brand of terror. No, this was the tannery, and among all the ghastly odours wafting from its soaked hides and bubbling vats, one scent reigned supreme. Not leather, not lye, but human urine, a fact that drifts in as gently as a bad dream. Medieval tanners used pee, quite a lot of it in fact, buckets of the stuff, collected daily from kindly neighbours, or not so kindly, depending on how frequently they visited the local alehouse. Some cities even had public ceramic pots for nighttime use, later gathered by what historians, with restrained enthusiasm, have dubbed piss collectors. Yes, they were real, and yes, they were exactly what they sound like. The reason for this liquid gold, apart from its generous availability, lay in the humble chemistry of ammonia. Human urine contains it in tolerable amounts, and ammonia helped loosen hair and flesh from animal hides before tanning. Imagine the scent of your least favorite public restroom after a hot summer day, then multiply it by 100 soaking sheepskins. The result was not so much earthy musk as it was apocalypse cologne. But to the medieval nose, which daily battled pig pens, chamber pots, and open sewers, the tannery's olfactory assault was just another Tuesday, or perhaps a particularly pungent Thursday. Once the hides were soaked in urine and draped over beams to soften and defuzz, it was time for the delicate process of flesh scraping. Using a tool that looked suspiciously like it belonged on a pirate ship, or perhaps a cheese board on steroids. Workers would meticulously remove residual flesh from the hides, often by hand. The result was cleaner skin, but also, frequently, strained backs, battered thumbs, and a sneaking existential crisis. But wait, the tanning process was just getting its groove. After urine and scraping came the real pièce de résistance, the tanning itself. And ho ho ho, this is where the magic of medieval science truly glittered with genius. Enter oak bark. Crushed and brewed into stews of tannin-rich delight, oak bark was dumped into massive vats. The previously soaked and scraped hides were now resubmerged, this time to draw in tannins and transform from rotting meat sheets into supple, nearly eternal leather. These vats would often sit for months. Just marinate that image for a moment. Tubs of animal skin stewing in bark broth in the dark corners of industry. And people complain about artisanal sourdough being slow. It's worth noting that tanners didn't use just oak. If oak bark was missing, or if one desired a more affordable bouquet of leather, perhaps for a budget-conscious cobbler, they might employ hemlock, sumac leaves, or even dog droppings. Yes, doggy-doo. It was prized for its enzyme content. We pause now for reflection. And hand sanitizer. To state the obvious, none of this smelled even remotely tolerable. But medieval tanners, often required to work far from town centres, developed a nose for it. In fact, their resilience was legendary. Children learned the trade young, and by adulthood, their olfactory nerves had probably waved a little white flag and retired. They were immune to the general horror of their craft, which, in a poetic twist, probably made them delightful guests at dinner parties. The kind who sipped soup as everyone else quietly left the room. Of course, it wasn't all a nasal tragedy. Despite the stink, tanneries produced one of the most valued materials of the medieval world. You couldn't have knights without leather armor, nor monks without leather-bound manuscripts, nor shoes, belts, saddles, or scabbards. A world without leather was a barefoot, bookless, brigand-filled nightmare. And somewhere, ankle-deep in bark brew, stood a grimy hero doing the grimy work that kept society clothed and functional. How did they keep their spirits up, you wonder? Possibly with song, possibly with ale, possibly with elaborate daydreams of becoming anything other than a tanner. But above all, with a sense of duty, and perhaps a clothespin. As twilight stretches over the dingy rooftops of the tannery town, and the vats steam with tireless purpose, we gently close the door on our brave, malodorous artisans. The winds shift, carrying us not forward in time, but laterally toward a quieter corner of medieval daily life, where another trade, less pungent but no less peculiar, performed its ancient, curious ritual. Somewhere beyond the clamour of medieval city gates, and just downstream from the least glamorous parts of town. And I do mean least glamorous. A figure in a woolen tunic quietly sharpens a knife on a whetstone. The grinding murmur joins the medley of other low, leathery sounds. The squelch of lime-soaked hides, the rhythmic slop of rawhide being stirred by a wooden paddle, the bubbling gurgle of mysterious fluids in deep vats that no one ever makes the mistake of sniffing twice. This is the tannery still hard, at work as twilight rolls in. And here, our imaginary visitor, at this point, more dreamlike than real, watches an aged tanner wield a tool called a fleshing knife, a charming name for a decidedly uncharming task, removing the lingering memory of the animal from his skin with long, scraping strokes. You know, just in case the hide forgot, it used to be a cow. The elder tanner hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby. though with lyrics long lost to time and probably not very soothing to begin with. Something about "don't slip your foot near the lime vat" and "beware the goat that bites." Occupational hazards. You see, by now you've grown acclimated to the scent, that perfume of fermented urine, wet fur, and the occasional whiff of despair. It's become a kind of comfort, in the way that travellers eventually stop noticing the creaking of a ship. It just means you're in the right place, among hides heavy with potential, and workers whose noses retired long ago. The day's final hides hang to dry in the open air, if of course one is generous enough to call it air. They sway gently, like flowerless garlands, casting long leathery shadows on the cobblestone. The tanning yard is quieting now. The clamour of splashing buckets and snorting livestock fades into the distance. Even the flies seem to clock out for the evening, perhaps unionised, their tiny aprons flung aside as they buzz off to find an equally revolting tavern. The apprentice, that loyal sidekick to the tannery's aromatic chaos, is on closing duty. He shuffles from vat to vat, muttering minor blessings, or perhaps curses, over the foul liquids left to steep overnight. The tools are rinsed in less than clean water and lean delicately against the wall, like swords awaiting a cleaner battlefield. Nearby, the lime pit sits still and pale as bone. This vat, deceptively quiet, has turned countless hides into pliable canvases, but has also allegedly claimed a few unfortunate souls, and possibly a few actual souls. One story goes that a tanner once lost his boot to the lime vat and dared not retrieve it, leaving it to dissolve like sugar in tea, though not quite as tasty. Inside the cottage-like workspace, if you can call a place that smells like old sheep a cottage, the parchment-thin pages of the account book lie open. Rows of notations track each hide: who brought it, where it came from, what stage of processing it's reached. One ox hide, villager Thomas, lime-soaked, de-haired, drying, paid with turnips. An honest living, if not a luxurious one. Oddly though, the tanner seems content. He sits by the hearth, sipping warm ale, probably brewed thicker than modern soup, and gazes into the flames like a man who's faced the worst from both beast and bucket, and came out, if not fragrant, then at least functional. It's easy to romanticize the medieval artisan, the cobbler in his shop, the cooper crafting barrels, the blacksmith hammering out horseshoes, and then there's the tanner, quietly saving the world from barefootedness, one revolting process at a time. Their craft was thankless, grimy, and malodorous, but without them, civilization would literally be left standing in its stockings. Evening settles in with a mist of scent that everyone pretends isn't there. Lanterns are lit in the upper windows, casting soft yellow light through horn-paned glass. The town prepares for rest, and so does the tannery. The last sound of the night? A gurgle from the fermentation vat that sounds suspiciously like a burp, which seems a fitting end to the day, really. Let us now wander toward quieter quarters of the medieval world, where perhaps things smell a touch sweeter. Though let's not get our hopes up. And now, as twilight seeps through the crooked beams of the tannery's slanted roof, let us drift sideways into one of the less glamorous byproducts of medieval leathercraft, the enduring problem of medieval footwear. Yes, we're tiptoeing into a world of turn shoes, ankle boots, and truly regrettable fashion decisions. Imagine, if you will, a dusty shelf in a medieval shoemaker's workshop. Upon it rest odd little leather creations that wouldn't look out of place on the feet of a mischievous woodland sprite. These were not high-performance hiking boots. No arch support, no memory foam. just a thin bit of cowhide standing between your tender 14th century arches and the cold, rat-nibbled cobbles of York. The most common shoe in the Middle Ages was known affectionately, though not very creatively, as the turn shoe. The name refers to the clever method of construction. Cobblers would stitch it inside out and then turn it right side out. Voila, a shoe. This method tucked the seams neatly inside, where they were less prone to wear, and, incidentally, more prone to rubbing uncomfortably against your foot. Cozy. But don't be fooled into thinking this simplicity meant uniformity. Oh no, even medieval feet weren't immune to fashion. By the late 14th century, European nobles began slipping their toes into the absurdly pointy delights of the poulain. These shoes were the medieval equivalent of saying, "I definitely don't walk anywhere." Some poulain toes reached lengths of 2 feet. Yes, 2 actual, measurable, inconvenient feet of curled leather, so long that some had to be tied to the ankle with a bit of string to avoid tripping over oneself while strolling through the Great Hall. In the London of 1394, authorities had had quite enough of such frivolity and tried to limit the pointiness to a mere 6 inches. Imagine being a medieval fashion police officer storming into a banquet just to measure someone's shoe tip. "Excuse me, my lord, but your instep appears to be violating Municipal Statute 4B regarding excessive toe extension." Meanwhile, back at the Tannery, there was a different set of problems. Shoes, as it turns out, are quite picky about their leather, soft for comfort, but strong for protection. The leather needs to be pliable, yet thick enough to cope with brambles, puddles, and the unpredictable behaviors of the average medieval goose. So the tanners began experimenting. Calfskin was prized, goat was durable, and pigskin could be surprisingly supple, though, admittedly, sometimes rather fragrant. Leather was tested not in labs, but in doorways and dirt tracks, and rather tragically, it didn't always hold up for long. A well-used shoe might last a few months, a season if you were lucky, before being turned into scraps, or merely disintegrating in one final squelch during Mass. And despite all this effort, common folk often went barefoot much of the time, especially in warmer months. Partly because shoes were expensive, and partly because, well, when the streets are already covered in all manner of organic misfortune, what's a bit of calloused skin between you and the world? Yet, the shoemakers, called cordwainers, persisted. They worked with delicate tools and smoothed each seam by candlelight. They stuffed aprons with scraps of discarded hide and pricked their fingers more times than they cared to count. These artisans were proud, skilled, and often slightly hunched from years of careful stitching. And just next door, the cobblers, yes, they were different, busied themselves with repairs. Cobblers didn't make shoes from scratch, no. Their job was to patch, strap, and nail once proud footwear back into usefulness. The line between the two trades was as clear as it was enforced. A cordwainer made, a cobbler mended, and heaven help the cobbler who dared to create a shoe from the ground up. Guilds were very touchy about such things. Turf wars over toe boxes and sole thickness weren't uncommon. Quiet ones, mind you. The kind that involved passive-aggressive muttering and disapproving glances at market fairs. So, picture it now. You, strapping a slightly damp turn shoe, made of partially cured pigskin, onto your aching foot, freshly recovered from yesterday's jousting rehearsal. The sky is grey, the mud is ankle deep, and the toe of your right poulain has curled in on itself like a cinnamon stick. It's hardly ideal, but exactly normal for its time. And, as the scent of centuries-old tallow and oxhide wafts gently from the rafters, we can slip back behind the scenes one last time, into the final secret stirring beneath this ancient, sticky trade, as twilight settles over our humble, olfactory battlefield of a medieval tannery. We find ourselves tiptoeing toward the final whiff of this pungent tale. The vats have quieted, the urine buckets no longer beckon, and even the hides, once bristling with defiance, have at last accepted their leathery fate. In the sweater weather hush of dusk, the tannery exhales a fermented sigh. It's done all it can, and frankly, so have we. But before you drift fully away, nestled into sleep like soft suede in a hayloft, let's glance one last time at the enduring legacy of this place, this temple of stink and stitches. For the medieval tanning operation wasn't just a smelly corner of town you avoided unless desperate for coin. No, it was an unlikely cornerstone of progress, enabling everything from armor padding to saddle straps. Even a noble's fancy belt had to begin somewhere, often caked in lime and soaking in pee. Leather, after all, was a miracle material in an age where synthetics didn't exist, plastic hadn't been dreamed of, and your choices were wood, wool, or something an animal once wore. It could be shaped into shoes, shield covers, gauntlets, grimy money pouches, and, if you were trendy circa 1347, a stylish doublet that whispered, "Yes, I do own a full set of knives." And all of that wonder came from the hands of people knee-deep in something that can only be lovingly described as biologically ambitious. Let us spare a thought for the poor apprentices, young, eager, and nose-blind, whose earliest lessons included not just how to scrape a hide, but how not to fall into a vat. Yes, that actually happened. Save for the occasional overzealous worker, most tanners emerged from these workplaces half ruined by the smell, and yet fully embedded in the economic sinews of medieval life. Without leather, no shoes. Without shoes, no travel without tetanus. Without travel, no trade. Without trade, well, the town's just sitting around in itchy wool socks, wondering why everyone's so cranky. The tanner's lot in life may have been grimy and malodorous, but it came with a strange sort of independence. Many tanners, despite their low social standing, had the financial means to own property, sponsor guild apprenticeships, or at the very least, afford the upgraded ale. You know, the kind with fewer wood chips and only moderate hallucinations. So while our modern noses may clutch at pearls, when reading about cow brain soaking or pigeon dropping fermentation, the medieval locals saw leatherwork less as grim drudgery and more as mildly tolerable grim drudgery with reasonable profits. Of course, the road to cleaner practices would eventually be paved by science, sewage systems, and an eventual realization that maybe, just maybe, the open-air tanning of animal flesh in the middle of town square was not the apex of urban planning. By the dawn of the 18th century, things began to shift. Chemical tanning, regulated waste disposal, and, most welcome of all, the swift invention of closed doors and windows for the general public's comfort. Looking back, the resilience of the tanner is something to marvel at. No gloves, no goggles, no wash your hands before returning to feudal labor. Just raw grit, elbow grease, and the quiet hope that you wouldn't be the one to lug the fresh bucket of dog feces up the hill that day. Now, as the medieval moon glows softly over sun-bleached hides and the silence of a job, finally, well done settles in, we step away from the tannery. Slowly now, past the sleeping vats, the softened leather sheets hung like prayer flags across the drying field, fluttering softly in the midnight breeze. The scent, though faint, still lingers. Less a stench now, more a memory. And in that tender, oddly fragrant silence, you may ponder that history is made not just by kings and poets, but by the quietly persistent, by the folks too stubborn to quit, even after the third vat of pungent goo. So rest now, brave time traveller. You've survived the Tannery, and with dignity, I might add. Let the moonlight rinse away any trace of ammoniac misadventures from your imagination. There will be more stories for other nights, and deeper mysteries to whisper to the stars. For now, drift gently into sleep, where even the stink of the past becomes something warm and distant, like memories folded into soft leather, tucked quietly under your dreaming head.